Hello everybody and welcome to another video. I was originally going to put this under my game design series, but I think we're going to touch on some broader topics here, so it's not going to be just game design. So instead, we're going to talk through what I think is perhaps a slightly controversial statement, maybe largely controversial, that the current situation we find ourselves in as a fantasy wargaming community with the Age of Sigmar and the Ninth Age are actually a golden age, or if they're not yet, they will be very soon. So if you don't agree with me yet, stick with me for the rest of this. We'll see if you don't agree with me by the time we're done. So let's get going. But first off, we're going to start out with a simple question. Is the crime rate in the U.S. higher or lower than it was 20 years ago? Okay? I will let you think about that for a second. All right, do you have your answer? All right, here's the real answer. The answer is it is insanely lower, okay? Not even a little. And by the way, this is true for most of the world. Not everywhere, but like I picked the U.S. just because I can easily get access to the DOJ's figures. And all these come from the Department of Justice. These are, but it's true over most of the developed and developing world. However, if you thought it was higher, well, you're not alone. Okay, so the sort of light green line is the actual violent victimization rate, which, as you can see, is much lower than it was 20 years ago. The green line is the people who think that the crime rate is higher. The percentage of people who think the crime rate is higher since 20 years ago. And these two charts line up pretty closely in timeline. I couldn't find exactly the same 2 years, but it's pretty close. Now, why am I talking about this? Who cares? I thought we were talking about Warhammer. What is the matter with you? Alright, well, here's what's the matter with me. My point here is that people's perception of things, especially in the modern world, where echo chambers and the internet make it easy to see reflections and shadows be thrown upon the wall of the cave, it's easy to believe that things are worse than they are. People tend to remember, in general, the past as better than it was and ignore the good things at present. Okay? Now, I'm sure you see where I'm going with this. And you might think there's no connection. I think there is a very real connection. The same psychology that makes people think this is the same psychology you're using when you think about your gaming. You don't have two different brains. You've only got one brain in your head. And we all think in the same way, in the same modalities, no matter what we're addressing. So, let's move on. So, the worst of times. All right, so I'm going to take you back to about the time that crime statistic started, which is about the early 90s. And from that point through up into the early 2000s, the fantasy wargaming community was basically a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. There was no landscape of choice at all. It was just, that was it. This was the game. Warhammer was a titan. It's not that there was nothing else around. There's always been small niche games, but they could never really break in. Warhammer was just so big, okay? Like market share on an extraordinary level. Now, and in a world of a sort of hegemonic single game, there are pros and cons. And, you know, the good part about this is that you develop a pretty large scene because everybody who wants to seriously wargame basically has one choice. But obviously the underside of that is all the people who are represented by those red arrows, right? People who, for whatever reason, weren't attracted to the game of Warhammer. It could be they picked up the massive tome of rules and were like, nope, not reading that. Or it could be they looked at the barrier of entry of cost and thought it was too expensive. Could be they didn't like the narrative or the aesthetic. I don't really care. It doesn't matter. The reason they turned away isn't very relevant. The point is simply that they had nowhere else to go. Okay? They simply either played this or basically played nothing. And a large part of that is because, unlike other products, you don't consume these by yourself, right? You need to have a community. And that's what makes these transitions very challenging and community upheavals very difficult. So even if you picked up a small indie war game you liked, if you couldn't find a pretty good-sized group of people to have regular games with and to go in on it and commit to spending whatever money was required, there's nothing you can do. You're just done. It's dead before it starts. Alright, so let's talk about spaghetti sauce. So I've mentioned this story in a previous video, but again, I feel it's very relevant. So back in the 60s and 70s, food companies were very obsessed with finding sort of the perfect thing. An easy example, and I'll link the original video. This is the story of this is told by Malcolm Gladwell back at a TED Talk in 2004. I highly recommend you listen to that TED Talk. It's wildly informative. And if you basically replace every time he says food with fantasy wargaming, you'll get more or less what I'm aiming at here. I guess I could have just redubbed his entire speech, but that would have been much less exciting. So anyways, people were trying to find a perfect product. And so an easy example of this is Pepsi came to him and said, hey, look, we want to make the perfect Pepsi. We want to know exactly how much aspartame is the perfect Pepsi. Well, the problem with that, and all these other attempts to have this perfect thing, is that it just doesn't work, right? So this guy, Howard Moskowitz, who's a researcher, graduate of Harvard, and an extremely smart guy, he did a bunch of research and figured out that, at a minimum, at baseline, consumers broke down into highly preferring 3 different types of sauces. There was a group that liked plain, there was a group that liked spicy, and there was a group that liked extra chunky, which, as Malcolm will tell you in the video, has lots of visible solids, which I agree with him is a great word. So the point being is that if you made just one, everybody was okay with it, but a lot of people were turned off, and you could never win the whole market. Because in these things of taste, you create peaks. There are lots of peaks. Taste is a hard thing to get your head around. I've attacked it in previous videos from angles of psychographic profiling and individual elements. But in the end, taste is this big, complicated mess of things. Why we like things is usually hard to pin down, and usually hard for us to even say what we would like more until we experience it. I could describe a cheese to you all you want. All day long, I could tell you about its nuttiness and its texture and all that. It might sound good to you, but until you taste it, you don't really know. And much it is the same with games. That's why it's hard for us to say exactly what we'd like in a game, or we think we'd like something, then we play it, and we're like, no, that doesn't actually work out because of X, Y, and Z. So in food, this has become the norm, right? When you go to a store, there are like 20 different versions of anything in there. You know, Oreos are a good example. If you go look at like the Oreo section in your grocery, chances are there's like normal and double stuff and thin and mint covered and Christmas and just whatever, on and on and on. Okay, why? Because they're trying to create higher peaks for each individual consumer. So let's go back to wargaming. So, as I said, since around 2000, somewhere in that period, the wargames market really has started to grow up. And I think Age of Sigmar was more it was more the result of this than perhaps the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were, than it was, the thing that caused it. It wasn't the first mover here. This was something that had been building up for a long time. That's, I think, in my opinion, one of the large reasons the Warhammer customer base was bleeding for so long, because they were just trying to make the one perfect Pepsi. And there isn't one perfect Pepsi. There's perfect Pepsis, as he says in the video. And, you have all these newer, innovative game companies coming into the market. They've got no shackles of previous rules and tradition. In a lot of the Sustainable Center's recent videos, he's talked about, exploration of different rules and things as he's been playing a lot of different games, and there are a lot of people doing very creative things out there. Things that may work better to suit the individual creative agenda of that game. And effectively what happened is people found that there are lots of different games out there that match better with their creative agenda, their psychographic profile, the play experience they want. And all that was bleeding off Warhammer, right? So, but the reality is Games Workshop isn't Nabisco or whoever makes Oreo, I don't know. They can't make 30 different versions of the game because it requires a lot of investment and stuff like that. However, we can have multiple versions of the game through them making Age of Sigmar, which is a widely casual game and sort of more easy for people to just kind of pick up and play and to walk in, buy the models they want. And you can have Ninth Age, which is the more competitive experience. It's much more complex, deeper rule set, that sort of thing. Both have their strengths and weaknesses, and both suit different creative agendas. And that's ultimately what I'm going to seize on next. So let's talk about creative agenda. I will link you the explanation of the big model of gaming. This was originally developed for role-playing, but as usual, I find these things, whether they're applied to CCGs or RPGs, they basically apply to games pretty well. Creative agenda is a really important thing I haven't talked about in detail before. I've kind of hinted around at it through the simulationism, gamism, narrativism. But the creative agenda is pretty simple. If you look at that little graphic down at the bottom, those are the big things and that sort of make up a game. The social contract on the outside, then exploration techniques and ephemera. As I said, you can go check out the page down below if you want to see definitions on everything. It's a little much to throw into the slides, but you can check it out. What I will say is that social contract, in the way we tend to use it, is not being used correctly. The way we talk about the social contract in gaming is just wholly being used incorrectly when it comes to game theory. What we actually mean when we say it is the creative agenda. Okay? And creative agenda, in general, breaks down to these sort of three things. And you can see them there. And so simulationism is basically the right to dream. It's often referred to as like verisimilitude, right? Gamism is the step-up thing. It's a contest. It focuses on tactics, resource management. Gamism is about contests of skill and things like that. And narrativism is where the story is king, right? So what I'll say here at a high level is that it's very hard to make a war game that appeals to somebody who really likes the third type of creative agenda. Because in narrativism, to some degree, the story needs to decide the rules, and you need almost no rules. And for those of you who might be like, well, then Age of Sigmar is perfect. Yes, Age of Sigmar is rules lighter, so certainly it could appeal to some form of narrativist. But as with all of these terms, there are spectrums, and the more hardcore somebody is pursuing a narrativist agenda, the more they will want the narrative to decide the rules. So an easy example is in something like the role-playing game Fate, right? Where you can overrule dice rolls to tell a good story through use of sort of in-game currency. Okay? You can just say, no, the story actually happened like this. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't work as well in a war game, where you're rolling to hit and you just say, no, it would be way more cinematic if my vampire lord just murdered all of those guys, so I'm going to say that just happens regardless of what I just rolled, right? But if we look at simulationism and gamism, I think that provides us a lot more fodder. Because in my mind, those map fairly strongly onto Age of Sigmar and onto the Ninth Age. And this sort of crystallized in my mind, and I wanted to put out this video when I watched one of Doom and Darkness's most recent Age of Sigmar battle reports. And he talked about how much more fun he was having since he started setting up a story around it. And I know that immediately sounds like, well, isn't that narrativist then? No. Because the story wasn't king, right? Everything is going to mix some of these. But what he was doing was using Age of Sigmar to simulate this thing, this story, right? And so he had rules that simulated in the most realistic way possible what was going on here. There was a verisimilitude to it, right? It's less about the rules and winning on the rules or something like that, cleverly using the rules, and more about just sort of experiencing it. And that's a big part of simulationism. Some major part of simulationism is just being able to experience this thing, to feel like the thing is what you're doing, right? Whatever it happens to be. So if you're in a role-playing game and you're, a knight in King Arthur's court, then having realistic plate armor and different weapons that are forged with very different quality, and Arthur is a sort of master warrior, and the Lady of the Lake can toss you a scimitar and get you all magicked up. Whatever your version of that happens to be, all of those things being there and having some kind of support is simulationism, right? Whereas the Ninth Age is much more about gamism. None of these are negative terms, by the way. It's much more about somebody who wants to experience this sort of very rules-driven, tactical, resource management sort of experience, right? And again, these aren't bad. This is all good. Having multiple games suiting multiple creative agendas lead to this world, right? Where more types of players find the game they like. Now, there's a downside to this, and that is that in the short run, there are less players for any individual game, okay? And that's where we are right now. These things are switching, things are kind of in tumult, and it's tough. Because communities break up and change, people, when you only had one thing before, and suddenly one of your buddies who maybe wasn't completely satisfied by the old experience, but was playing it because, well, it was the only thing to do and all his friends were, now suddenly finds that he can find a community that's more aligned with what his creative agenda is. That can be hard, right? And but what that does over time is it creates a positive experience for more people. More people have a good experience with the game they're playing. And here's really the key. It creates more stickiness. And it creates more willingness to explore. Somebody who comes into the game and plays something that isn't really aligned with the creative agenda they want to pursue, okay, might stick around for a little while, but they're probably gone. They're a dead man walking in the hobby. And you really ask yourself how many people like this. They came in, they were all about it, they got into it, and then they got burned. They were just like, and then they leave and they kind of drift out of the hobby. I know people like that. I'm betting you do too, okay? That's because that game wasn't sticky enough for them. In the end, it didn't align well enough with them to really hold their overall interests, right? Having something that suits your creative agenda means that it creates that alignment, okay? And over time, since these things aren't hard lines, it's not, again, just like with Johnny, Timmy, and Spike, finding somebody who is, 100% wanting to explore this single creative agenda all the time is fairly rare. They're out there, but they're not common. Most people will like to dip their toes into other waters. And so the more games we have set up, they're ready to catch people who become interested in the hobby. The more inroads we've got, or perhaps the better way to say it is the more on-ramps into the big hobby of wargaming, the more those same gamers will try these other games. By the way, this has great consequences for every other war game out there. If you love Infinity or Malifaux or anything like that, this is going to be a great time for you as well, because as people come in and try this game, they're going to go and explore those other games eventually, most likely, to see what other things also suit their creative agenda. To put this all very simply, the more we have games that people will enjoy the first time they play and will hold them longer, the bigger the pool of wargamers becomes, and the better off we all are as wargaming hobbyists. Okay? Alright, so let's sum up. So the Golden Age. This is, or will be very soon, the Golden Age of miniature wargaming. Why do I think that? Well, for everything I told you already. More games that suit more creative agendas. We've got better models than we ever have. coming out from a host of different people, not just Games Workshop, but from a lot of different miniatures companies. We've got more games than I ever remember, and I've been wargaming. There's a lot of people who are in this who have been wargaming longer than me, but I've been doing it for 18 years now. And I feel like there are more vibrant, awesome games out there to try. We've got specialist games coming back from GW. You've got Frostgrave out there. I mentioned Malifaux and Infinity already. You've got War Machine and Hordes, which is big. I mean, really, it's a great time if you want to try some different games. On the same side, communication is easier than ever before, meaning that we can ramp up that community building much quicker. Okay? And that creates tons of passionate fans sharing that passion. And I'll tell you what makes me want to play games, the reason I picked up Malifaux was because I saw people on YouTube that I respect playing it, being positive about it, saying, hey, this is really cool. And I was like, that does look really cool. I should give it a try. I tried it. I loved it. I bought it. That's it. You want to build a community? Share your passion for it. Be positive about it, right? And that wins people over. And finally, and something that's certainly going to benefit the Ninth Age, is that there's just an easier go-to-market right now, right? More creators can bring their ideas to the masses easier, whether that means something like Kickstarter or just a community project like Ninth Age, right? People love this stuff and are willing to put in their time and effort, their blood, sweat, and tears, and that's awesome. So I don't think anybody should look at this as a negative time. I'm not saying that there's nothing bad going on. In my original crime statistics, it wasn't like there's zero violent crime, okay? But I think it's important to retain perspective and to think of all of these positives that are here on this page and how amazing it is. You know, if we were wargaming in the 60s, you probably wouldn't have a game store in your town. You probably would have to subscribe to some kind of mail order letter that went out once a month that somebody typed up on their typewriter and then hand mailed to everybody. You'd play some by mail games, and you'd get together maybe once or twice a year at a convention if you didn't have anybody who lived in your neighborhood who played these games. We are a long way from that. Okay? And by the way, you were playing with like cutout bits of cardboard at best. Right? So just the complete and total package and the amazing variability that this hobby has become, has grown into, I think means we should look upon this very positively and continue to explore all of these things. And most importantly, do not hate on people for what they like. They're just pursuing a different creative agenda than you. And that should be respected. We're all wargamers, and you never know. Be positive. You might win them over to try your game. So, all the videos I mentioned will be linked below, as well as the web pages that I pulled stats from and things like that. And if you have any questions, I'd love to hear. Please list them below. I would also love to hear your thoughts on this, as always. I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time.